If the contract is subject to finance, you must take all reasonable steps to obtain finance approval by the finance date. This includes making a finance application shortly after the contract date and pursuing the application diligently. If you fail to take reasonable steps to obtain finance approval, you may be prevented from relying on the finance condition to terminate the contract. If you do seek to terminate the contract under the finance condition, the seller may be entitled to request evidence that you have taken reasonable steps. When you have a letter of finance approval from the financier, you should send it to us. We can answer questions about the finance approval. However, you must obtain the finance approval, and decisions relating to the acceptability or otherwise of conditions in the finance approval rests with you. We must notify the seller as to whether you have satisfactory finance approval on or before 5 p.m. on the finance date. If you do not obtain satisfactory finance approval from your financier, you can instruct us to terminate the contract or seek an extension of time for finance. Agreement from the seller is required to any extension, and your request may be declined. Alternatively, you may instruct us to give notice to the seller, waiving the benefit of the finance condition. Waiving the benefit of finance condition means you are bound to complete the contract regardless of whether your financier approves finance or the finance terms are satisfactory. If we do not notify the seller that finance is approved or waived by the finance date, then the contract continues and both you and the seller have a right to terminate the contract. You also have a continuing right to give notice of satisfactory finance or waiver of the benefit of finance condition up until the time the contract is terminated by the seller. If you want to give notice of satisfactory finance or waiver of the condition, you will need to give us instructions to give notice to the seller. Notice will not be effective unless received by the seller before the seller terminates the contract. If you do not have sufficient funds to pay the balance purchase price, including any adjustments, at settlement, the seller may terminate the contract and seek to have you specifically perform the contract, and in both instances can claim compensation from you. And finally, once notice of finance approval is given to the seller under the contract, it cannot be withdrawn. You should, however, be aware that most financial institutions will reserve the right to withdraw finance approval at any time prior to settlement for any number of reasons. It is important that you consider very carefully any conditions attaching to a finance approval and your ability to satisfy all requirements, now and up until settlement, relevant to the advance of funds before instructing us to give any notice about finance under the contract.